Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the investigations editor for openDemocracy, Peter Geoghegan, and the former government advisor, Anita Boateng. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages. The Eye carries the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace's advice to Afghans looking to flee their homeland: avoid air travel and try to use land borders instead. That's also the lead story in The Guardian. The Metro mocks the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab's assertion that he couldn't leave his holiday on the island of Crete as Kabul was falling because, in his words, the sea was closed. The Star also has that story. The Telegraph has heard plans are underway to allow 12-year-olds to be given the COVID vaccine without parental consent. The Daily Express also looks at COVID vaccinations with their focus on the urgent plea to roll out booster jabs. And the Financial Times carries a story about city regulators fearing they can't properly control one of the world's biggest cryptocurrency exchanges, known as Binance. And we're joined tonight by Peter Geoghegan and Anita Boateng. Good evening to both of you. We're going to start with the Eye. And it's pretty grim advice from the Defence Secretary following that updated advice from the Foreign Office in the last hour or so about the threat of a terrorist attack at Kabul airport, that people should move away to a safe location, await further advice. The Defence Secretary telling people, Peter, to forget about the airport and try and flee via the border.
Yes, we have Ben Wallace, who has, in a briefing to MPs, has said that there's only a few places left on British rescue flights. So that means there's going to be, probably, hundreds, if not more, British citizens and Afghans who trying to get back to the United Kingdom that are going to really struggle to get out. And it really does show just how disastrous the situation is. We're hearing talk earlier at the top of your programme about a humanitarian crisis. And what I think today's front pages are showing is just how the lack of control that we've seen in the last few days is, if anything, seems to be getting worse. Only yesterday we were talking about 72 hours, but now it feels like in Afghanistan things are happening at almost warp speed. 2 weeks ago it was 3 or 4 weeks before Kabul would fall, and now we're talking about effectively the British government telling people not to go to the airport, telling Britons not to go to the airport, and to try and find third countries out. To do.
Anita, we've had the Pentagon earlier on saying evacuations will be continuing until at the end of the month, but we know that the civilian evacuations have to end before that if you're to get all the troops out. But now it seems that this security threat, the threat of terrorism, is accelerating the situation yet further.
Absolutely. And I think the challenge is actually from ISIS, that they may take some action in order to disrupt the activity in the airport, which, as Paul says, is already incredibly chaotic. I think it's very clear that part of the political push, particularly from the US, to ensure that there is this deadline of symbolic relevance to the United States to get troops out, has exacerbated what you would expect around kind of the usual disruption that is involved in evacuating and getting out the number of people that is required. And it does seem as though there's even indications that the UK could be withdrawing as early as this Friday. So it's really becoming incredibly chaotic, incredibly panicked. And actually, there's a lot of reports of people who are staying in their homes because they don't feel it's safe to go to the airport, almost irrespective of what we're hearing tonight about the possible threats from ISIS.
I think that's the gap, isn't it, Peter, between what we're being told particularly by the US, by President Biden, about, get people to the airport and we will try to get you out, and the situation on the ground when people literally cannot get to the airport.
Well, just a few months ago, Joe Biden was asked about the famous airlift out of Saigon, kind of heralded the end of the US involvement in Vietnam in 1975, and said, nothing like that will happen in Afghanistan. It will be a very orderly withdrawal, and we are looking at anything but an orderly withdrawal. It's incredibly disorderly. It's quite clear that, you know, whatever planning was done was nowhere near sufficient. And it's actually even quite striking that it's not just in Afghanistan we're seeing that. Like on Open Democracy today, we ran a story about a flight, an evacuation flight from Afghanistan that sat on the tarmac for 24 hours in Birmingham, actually even longer than that, where so a mix of, you know, Afghan nationals and British citizens were left effectively stranded with little food or water and access to sanitation. So it seems to be chaotic across the piece. And if anything, you know, what's going to happen on the 31st of August, which is the pull-out date, you know, it begs the question, you know, how chaotic it could become. And the threat from ISIS and other terrorist organizations, you know, is also hardly kind of a new and novel phenomenon. This is something that has been aware, you know, since for a very long time. So I think, you know, whatever happens on the back of this, there needs to be a massive post-mortem into just how this situation was allowed to take place in the first place.
This story on the front of The Guardian as well. Head for the border, UK tells Afghans trying to flee. And then what, Anita?
That's exactly it. It does feel as though part of the challenge, and when we talk about intervention, we tend to focus quite a lot on what happens when you do act, but there is a kind of challenge of what you do when you don't act. Like, what are the kind of investments and support you're giving to neighbouring countries that allows this to really work in a way that is joined up? And I think that, you know, The Guardian's got a great story kind of covering some of the challenges that might arise as a result of heading in back to the border rather than trying to get a flight out of Afghanistan.
Yeah, and the prospects for those who either flee to a third country or those who decide they have no option but to stay in Afghanistan are getting bleaker by the minute, aren't they, Peter, with those warnings from the World Food Programme today about the humanitarian crisis, the risk of starvation.
Yes, it's quite clear that it seems to be both a humanitarian crisis on the cusp of unfolding in Afghanistan, and also there's going to be a lot of people who have helped what will be seen as the occupation forces for the last 2 decades. You know, just today I had contact with somebody who's worked on a DFID project, you know, on a British aid project in Afghanistan, who's trying to get out of Kabul with his family and is fearful for his life. We're already hearing stories that, you know, the Taliban have said that they're going to be merciful and that they're not going to seek vengeance, but we're already hearing stories of summary executions of people who worked with American and British forces in Afghanistan. And it does beg that huge question, 20 years on, what has been achieved? What's been achieved by the past 20 years in Afghanistan? What's been achieved by, you know, the invasion and the huge amounts of money that went into it? But also, if we are on the cusp of a humanitarian disaster, well, how is the world going to react to that? How is it going to engage? You know, in many ways, the Taliban were empowered last year by Donald Trump when they had the Doha Agreement, in which basically effectively it was agreed that the Taliban will be able to take over Afghanistan and the American forces would leave. So having empowered the Taliban, I guess the question is now, does the international community and does the Americans and to a lesser extent the British have any sway over the Taliban and to force them to actually even help? You know, there was a large play made last week by Dominic Raab of they're going to increase aid spending by 10% to Afghanistan, having cut it by 80% earlier this year. There's a big question about how will aid spending be possible at all in Afghanistan on the back of this.
Let's talk a little bit more about Dominic Raab. He features on the front of a couple of the papers today. Let's have a look at the Metro. Paddled be likely. Now, Dominic Raab, of course, as the Taliban were arriving at the gates of Kabul, was on holiday. He has defended that decision today, defended himself, Anita, against claims that he was on the beach and paddleboarding. What's he had to say?
Well, I think he essentially said that it was all nonsense and a lot of the detail that had emerged to add sort of colour to the story, that he was paddling, for instance, was nonsense. He said that the sea was closed that day, so presumably he couldn't have been paddleboarding. I think his point was simply that he felt like a lot of the coverage of this just wasn't accurate. Look, I have some sympathy with the foreign secretary in the sense that this does feel as though it is a big distraction as a result of the fact that we, as journalists, as the commentariat, feel quite powerless in when we're watching the kind of harrowing scenes of Afghanistan. And I think there is a natural urge to kind of be like, what could have been, who hasn't been doing their job? Who can we blame? And I think the question about how much of a difference, whether this, whether there was someone on the other end of the line, even for the foreign secretary to call, I think has sort of, we've distracted ourselves a little bit.
Well, it wasn't just the Foreign Secretary, was it? It was the senior civil servants at the Foreign Office, at the Home Office, etc. as well. There was a feeling that there was a vacuum of power at a point at which key decisions needed to be made to help those people in Afghanistan.
And what I would say is I think that there is a definite challenge from that we can issue to the Foreign Office, which is around like, what is the policy? What is the approach to intervention when you're in a context where the intelligence seems to have been a little unclear and where we're so reliant on the US? What is the UK's role going to be? And I think there are some really substantial questions, and I hope some substantial lessons that the Foreign Office can take from this. I think the questions around like physical presences in different offices seems to be slightly separate, because it does feel as though officials and in particular soldiers have been working around the clock in Afghanistan to help people most in need.
Let's just have a look at the Star, Peter, shall we? Because it, like the Metro, is having a bit of fun with this. Quite an image it has on its front page of the Foreign Secretary on his paddleboard, which he said he couldn't be on because the sea was closed. The point is, this isn't going away for Dominic Raab, is it?
No, and I'll try and not go to read the headline myself. At least I slip up upon it. But no, I don't think it will. And I think Anita's point is fair. Like, in many ways, this is, it's quite fun to think of Dominic Raab and away on his holidays, and it begs all sorts of questions about what he was doing and what he wasn't doing. But I think the reason why it resonates is probably less, it's less to do with the specifics of Crete and whether the sea was closed or not on a given day, which is quite it seems to be quite a fatuous comment for someone to make, but more to do with the fact of, well, what was the Foreign Secretary's policy in this area? He's been the Foreign Secretary for quite a long time. He was the Foreign Secretary when the Doha Agreement was signed. What was his views then? What were Britain's views on the signing of a peace deal with the Taliban by the Trump administration? Was there any kind of push back against it? What was that? What was happening there? Like, what was the policy for Afghanistan? We've had an integrated review recently, which is basically very much pivot around the idea of global Britain, post-Brexit's Britain's role in the world. And I think we're getting a real dose of realpolitik here, which is that it's fine to write policy papers talking about Britain's role in the world, but actually what Britain's been left doing for the last week is kind of pleading with the Americans to please not go so soon, and the Americans saying, we don't really care what you think, and doing it anyway. And Britain is left trying to mop it up. And so, whether Dominic Raab was not on holiday or not on holiday probably wouldn't have made a huge difference over the last week or so. But whether he was actually completely engaged with this issue in the last year or so probably would have.
And then the Americans, of course, Peter, saying, well, it's not up to us now anyway, it's up to the Taliban, the situation that we now find ourselves in. Peter, Anita, we're just going to take a brief pause. Coming up, should 12-year-olds be able to get the COVID vaccine without parental consent? We'll be discussing that next. Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me now, Peter Geoghegan and Anita Boateng. Turning to coronavirus, which is also on the front of several papers today. Peter, at the Daily Express, urgent plea to roll out booster jabs. Now, this is following studies showing that vaccine protection can decline after 6 months.
Yeah, so we're seeing a kind of, unsurprisingly, this is similar conversations happen in other countries too, where this, where they're quite pronounced around the rollouts kind of quite far on. It similarly happened in Israel a few months ago, where the efficacy of almost all vaccines, to different extents, does seem to decrease after a period of time. And after 6 months, it decreases quite dramatically, although it still seems that vaccinations will still protect people against severe illness and probably death as well, which is a good thing. And so the conversation now is turning to boosters. So it's interesting to see this becoming a big kind of issue already. You know, the World Health Organization has said that, like, really at the moment, the issue isn't boosters for the developed world, it's actually vaccines for the underdeveloped world. You know, because what we're seeing is actually across the West, there's enough vaccines for everyone who wants them. The issue is still getting enough people to take them. But in the other parts of the world, particularly in African countries, there's really, really low levels of vaccination and real kind of concerns that 2022 could actually see much higher rates of COVID death than even 2021 or 2020 because of a lack of vaccination. So it's kind of interesting what we're kind of having this conversation about. Let's roll out boosters. And so far, the medical opinion seems to be quite mixed on this. Some people are suggesting they might be needed. Others are suggesting it's too early. Perhaps we'll see boosters for the older age group rolled out with the flu vaccine too, but a lot of that still seems to be kind of up in the air and to be decided.
Yeah, Anita, this is also on the front of the Telegraph. We're expecting a JCVI announcement within the coming days on whether the booster programme is going to go ahead and what form it will be, because a debate now over whether you give boosters to the over 50s, for example, or whether you vaccinate 12-year-olds and upwards, as we've seen in other countries.
Yes, or indeed, you know, whether you do both or neither. It does feel as though the plans for a third booster are much more developed than this possibility of 12 to 15-year-olds being vaccinated. So it does feel as though that would be the natural next step, though, as you say, we wait for the JCVI, who advise the government on such matters, to make a final decision. And so it does feel as though the priority will probably be around the most vulnerable people. Now, obviously, as we're seeing a return to schools, we've had summer festivals, we will have more people indoors in September. I think cases, we do expect them to rise, and most scientists do. And therefore, I think this conversation, particularly around schools and how you ensure that a number of people can obviously stay in school and protect the vulnerable, that conversation will continue, and it'll be very interesting to see where it ends up.
Anita, Peter, thank you very much indeed.